Before the railroad, America was, to put it mildly, inconveniently large. Getting from New York to California was a 6-month ordeal involving seasickness, dysentery, or just giving up and settling somewhere in Missouri. Everyone agreed something had to be done. The solution, of course, was the Transcontinental Railroad, a glorious, nation-binding project of iron and steam. It was sold to the public with all the patriotic fanfare you'd expect: manifest destiny on wheels, a technological marvel to unite a fractured country post-Civil War. A beautiful vision. It's always a beautiful vision right before a handful of people get obscenely rich at everyone else's expense. The dream was to connect a continent. The reality was about to become the greatest, most audacious, and most federally funded private heist in American history. They weren't just building a railroad, they were laying the tracks for a whole new kind of power. So, how do you convince private companies to build thousands of miles of track through mountains and deserts? You could offer them a simple contract. Or, if you're the U.S. Congress in 1862, you could just give them the country. The Pacific Railway Acts were a masterclass in creative incentives. For every mile of track a company built, they received a 400-foot right-of-way plus 10 square miles of public land in a checkerboard pattern along the route. They gave away land they didn't even really control, most of it belonging to Native American nations, but details. All told, the government handed over roughly 175 million acres to the railroad companies. That's an area larger than Texas. This wasn't just a subsidy, it was a transfer of a public trust on an unthinkable scale. The government was essentially paying private corporations with the nation's most valuable asset, land, to build a service they would then own and operate for private profit. It's like paying a contractor to build your house and then giving them your entire neighborhood as a thank you. Building this continental marvel required more than just free land. It required an astonishing amount of back-breaking labor. And the companies were very strategic about who they hired. The Union Pacific, building from the east, primarily used Irish immigrants and desperate Civil War veterans. The Central Pacific, coming from California, imported over 15,000 workers from China. They were paid less than white workers and given the most dangerous jobs, like dangling off cliffs in baskets to blast tunnels through the Sierra Nevada mountains. For this privilege, they earned about $1 a day. The death toll was staggering, with hundreds, possibly thousands, killed by explosions, avalanches, and disease. Yet, when the famous Golden Spike ceremony was held in 1869, celebrating the railroad's completion, the iconic photograph features exactly 0 of the Chinese laborers who made the western half possible. They were conveniently erased from the triumphant narrative they had literally carved into the earth. Progress looks a lot different when you're the one holding the dynamite. The massive swaths of land granted to the railroads happened to be occupied. The Plains tribes, like the Lakota and Cheyenne, had lived there for centuries. To the railroad magnates, this was not a human issue, it was a logistical one. The railroad was a weapon. It could move troops and supplies faster than any army on horseback, enabling the U.S. military to project power deep into previously inaccessible territories. Forts sprang up along the tracks like poisonous mushrooms. But the most effective weapon wasn't the soldier. It was the hunter. The railroad enabled the industrial-scale slaughter of the American bison, the central pillar of Plains Indian life. Hunters would shoot them from the train windows for sport. Between 1870 and 1875, an estimated 2.5 million hides were shipped east per year on the new railways. By destroying the bison, they destroyed the economy, the culture, and the spirit of the people who depended on them. It wasn't collateral damage, it was a feature, not a bug. Once the tracks were down, the railroads needed people to run them, and towns for those people to live in. Why leave that to chance? It was far more efficient to just own the town. Enter the company town, a perfect little feudal kingdom in the heart of industrial America. The most famous was Pullman, Illinois, built by the palace car magnate George Pullman. On the surface, it was a paradise, clean brick houses, parks, a library. But Pullman owned it all. The homes, the church, the gas, the water. Workers were paid in Pullman scrip, which was often only usable at the Pullman-owned stores with their Pullman-inflated prices. Your rent was deducted directly from your paycheck. If you were fired, you were evicted. Complaining was a one-way ticket to unemployment and homelessness. It was a system of total control disguised as paternalistic care, a velvet-gloved cage where your entire existence was a line item on the company's balance sheet. The railroads had sold the dream of the West to millions of settlers. Cheap land, a fresh start, the Jeffersonian ideal of the independent yeoman farmer. People poured into places like Kansas and Nebraska, broke the sod, and planted their crops. Then came the harvest, and a sudden, horrifying realization. There was only one way to get their grain to market: the railroad. And the railroad knew it. These companies, which existed because of public land grants, became private monopolies that could charge whatever they pleased. They owned the grain elevators and set extortionate storage fees. They gave secret rebates to large corporate farms while squeezing every last penny out of the small guys. The very tool of liberation had become an instrument of economic bondage. Farmers who had fled wage labor in the East found themselves trapped in a new form of serfdom, working their land only to hand over the profits to a faceless corporation hundreds of miles away. For most of human history, time was a local affair. When the sun was highest in the sky, it was noon. This worked fine until you had trains moving at a blistering 50 miles per hour across thousands of miles. A train leaving a station at 10 a.m. local time would arrive at the next town over where it was suddenly 10:12 a.m., and the whole system collapsed into chaos. Conflicting schedules caused confusion and deadly collisions. So, did the government step in to standardize this mess? Of course not. The railroads did it themselves. On November 18, 1883, at noon, American railroads simply switched to a new system of 4 standardized time zones. Poof! Just like that. There was no act of Congress, no public debate. The most powerful corporations in the country looked at reality, decided it was inefficient, and rewrote it for their own convenience. They didn't just own the land and the economy, they now owned the clock. They made America run on their time. Who were the architects of this new empire? They were called captains of industry, but robber barons has a more accurate ring to it. Men like Leland Stanford, Collis P. Huntington, and Jay Gould weren't inventors. They were masters of the system. They perfected the art of using public funds for private gain. Their crowning achievement in corruption was the Credit Mobilier scandal. The heads of the Union Pacific Railroad created a fake construction company credit mobilier, and then, as directors of the railroad, hired their own fake company to build the tracks. They charged the government and their stockholders obscene amounts for the work, pocketing tens of millions of dollars in fraudulent profits. And how did they get away with it? They gave shares in this phantom company to influential congressmen to ensure nobody looked too closely. It was a brilliant, self-contained loop of corruption where the people meant to be overseeing the project were getting rich from the fraud itself. A business model that, you might notice, never really went out of style. So yes, the railroads tied the nation together with an iron ribbon. They spurred incredible industrial growth and populated a continent. That's the story we tell ourselves. But it's a story that leaves a few things out. The railroad was the engine of the Gilded Age, an era defined by the most extreme wealth inequality the country had ever seen. It created a new kind of entity in America, the modern corporation, with power that rivaled the government itself. It pioneered the business of lobbying, of crushing unions, of creating monopolies, and of privatizing profits while socializing costs. It showed that with enough money and political influence, you could take public assets, use immigrant labor, dispossess native populations, and trap farmers in debt, all under the banner of progress. The Iron Horse wasn't just a machine for transportation, it was a blueprint for power, a lesson in how to build an empire not of land, but of economic control. A lesson America learned very, very well. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!